This is the You Winning Life Podcast, your number one source for mastering a positive existence. Each episode will be interviewing exceptional people, giving you empowering insights, and guiding you to extraordinary outcomes. Learn from specialists in the worlds of integrative and natural wellness, spirituality, psychology, and entrepreneurship. So you too can be winning life. Now, here's your host, licensed marriage and family therapist, certified neuro-emotional technique practitioner, and certified entrepreneur coach, Jason Wasser.
Hey everybody, today's guest is Dr. Richard Johnson. He's a physician and has been a medical scientist for over 25 years. He is internationally recognized for his work on the role of sugar and its component fructose as it relates to obesity and diabetes. He's the author of The Sugar Fix and The Fat Switch, and he's presently a professor of medicine at the University of Colorado in Denver. We're going to get into his newest book called Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, the surprising science behind why we gain weight and how we can prevent and reverse it. He's board certified in internal medicine, infectious disease, and kidney disease. He has published over 700 papers, and he's the founding editor of the comprehensive clinical nephrology book that is the industry standard. And I'm just so excited to talk to him about how our health, how our diet, how our food leads us to becoming healthier, happier human beings, and what we can do to prevent disease, any type of struggles with our energy and our mood. And I really look forward for you getting benefit out of today's episode. All right, guys. So it's been a while since I had a interview that I've been doing for, as we're getting close to just releasing episode 150, if you're caught up, which means that you're going to be hearing this episode a little bit later than that, but we're really back in my wheelhouse of passion. And as you heard in the intro, we're going to be talking about sugar cravings, weight, stress handling, the psychology of stress and what our body craves, and what we're predisposed to when it comes to nature and how we can have that nurture versus nature mindset. So again, Dr. Rick, thank you so much for hanging out with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. It's great to be on your show.
So, of all the 1,000,000,001 places we can start, I want to just maybe get some terminology out of the way, because I'm sure that, commonly we'll use some stuff that we throw around, or we're going through books, or we're reading blogs, and people who are interested in this area of self-care and health will start hearing certain terms coming up over and over again, especially if they've gone into the keto world, or the intermittent fasting stuff, or they're just getting, low sugar, low carbs, maybe more protein based, or, all the different terminology. So I want to start off with just first what we're probably going to be talking about, at least as the basis for where we get into different things, is two different things. One is the metabolic syndrome or metabolic disorder, and the other thing would be insulin resistance. And I know we're getting technical, everybody. We're starting off really technical, but it'll make sense why I'm starting here as our episode goes on. So please start. Let's start there.
Yeah.
So the other stuff.
So the metabolic syndrome was first coined, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, when they noticed that certain symptoms and signs kind of grouped together often. And so people would come in with blood glucoses that were elevated, but not so high that you were diabetic. So, remember, glucose is the main sugar in our blood. And if it gets really high, it causes the disease diabetes. And if it gets really low, it causes hypoglycemia, where you get lightheaded and sweaty. And so it's a really important fuel, and we try to keep it in a very normal range, typically between 75 and 100 or so. And so most of us, have glucoses in that. But then when you eat, your glucose level goes up because you're eating food that has glucose. And then that stimulates this hormone insulin, which brings the glucose back down. And the insulin moves the glucose into the muscle and into the tissues where you can use it. So like when you eat bread, you're producing the starch, and the bread's broken down to glucose. It's a fuel. It goes up in your blood. Insulin gets secreted, and it moves the glucose into the muscle where it's used for energy. Okay. So the metabolic syndrome turned out to be this setting where people recognize that you happen to be sort of pre-diabetic, that your glucose levels were higher than normal. So maybe like 110 or 115, not so high that it was diabetes, but it was abnormally high. So we call it pre-diabetic. You're pre-diabetic when your glucose levels tend to be high. And it's associated, and it's due to the fact that your tissues become resistant to the effects of insulin, so that the insulin goes up in the blood, but it doesn't really work that well to moving the glucose into the muscles. So the muscle is resistant to the effects of insulin, so they call it insulin resistance. So that turned out to be pre-diabetes, insulin resistance, and that's part of this syndrome of metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is also associated with obesity. So you tend to be obese, and particularly around the waist, abdominal obesity, they call it. And so it's like the fat is inside our abdomen, and you can get fatty liver with that, and you can get fat in the blood, which we call triglycerides. And so this kind of spectrum of fat in the blood and fat in the liver and abdominal obesity and pre-diabetes, and then the blood pressure tends to be a little high, and there's a little bit of inflammation in the blood. This is what is very common in people who are destined to develop diabetes. And one quarter of our population has this syndrome called metabolic syndrome. Now, when it was first described by the endocrinologists, they all said, hey, you know what? This is abnormal. This is, this is on the route to developing diabetes. This is on the route to developing hypertension. This is on the route to developing severe obesity. And, it's like the big warning sign when you start developing metabolic syndrome. When you see your doc, he starts putting you in medicine to lower cholesterol, blood pressure. And it's like this slippery slope where you could go on to become diabetic. And it's true. That is true. What our work found, which is really interesting, is that this is actually a normal syndrome that animals use to prepare for times when there's no food. So like if you're a big bear, and you got to sleep through that winter because there's no food around, you got to have some fat in your belly, and you got to have some fat in your liver and some fat in your blood, because you're going to need it, because if you don't have food, the fat can be broken down to energy. And here's what's cool. Insulin resistance turns out to be something animals like to have if they're like at risk for starving. And you know why? Mm-hmm. Because if the muscle's resistant to taking up insulin, to taking up glucose, then what happens is the glucose goes up in the blood, and it goes up slightly high, which we know is pre-diabetic. Right. But the brain can take up glucose even when there is insulin resistance. Uh-huh. So it's a way of preserving the glucose for the brain, because if you're at risk for starving, you want your brain to work. You want to be able to see those predators. You want to be able to be able to figure out how to get more food. And so the brain tops it. So insulin resistance is actually used by animals to help them survive when there's not that much food around. And so it's all part of one syndrome. Our group found that the metabolic syndrome isn't just this. It also includes being hungry. There's a drive to get hungry. You get hungry. It drives foraging. Foraging is when an animal searches for food. I used to think, you're just searching for food, but actually it's a behavior. Uh-huh. You have to be able to be strong enough to go into areas where you've never been before. So you have to be a little brave.
Right.
You have to have some kind of exploratory behavior.
Sounds like motivation, actually,
Yeah.
for
And
to
so
go out there
these
into the
can be
world.
good things. It's like
Yeah.
being a scout. You have to be willing to go into an area where no one's been before, and there could be monsters and predators and dinosaurs, who knows? But so you have to have that willingness. And then here's another thing: you have to be able to look around very quickly and make quick assessments. So you got to look to the right, to the left, up, down, and you can't deliberate. You can't like focus on one area too long, because you're constantly moving. And if you find food, sometimes you have to eat it really fast so that you can move on, so it can stimulate like binging. So what's incredible about this metabolic syndrome is that there's all these other things that are going on. It's actually a whole survival response, and it's great in the short term. And like if you want to be an astronaut, you probably want to have a foraging response. They're like heroes, right?
Yeah.
But let's say that you keep activating that pathway all the time. Now, instead of like being able to concentrate on a thing, your mind is shifting and changing, and you have what we call attention deficit, because you're looking everywhere. You're taking in a lot of things, but you're not actually focusing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so what's happened is we have identified behaviors like attention ADHD and mania, bipolar disorder, is associated with sugar intake. And sugar turns out to be the main thing that drives this metabolic syndrome. And that we believe that ADHD and bipolar and a lot of things are directly linked biologically with excessive activation of this survival switch. Yeah. And my book, Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, talks about our discovery of this switch and how it can be involved in a lot of behavioral issues. Now, I'm not saying that this is like destined that you are going to get ADHD right. if you're eating a lot of sugar. No, it's sort of like a predisposition, and the kinds of things you do, Jason, are so fantastic, because a lot of the brain is working. So what we're doing is it's sort of like driving instinctual behavior. It's mm-hmm. sort of like predisposing you.
Right, or programming.
Yeah, programming. But it's not something that is forced, fixed. You can modify it, but it can be a very powerful problem. And so and so our work found that the metabolic syndrome is actually a normal process that animals use, and the way they do it. You know how the bear does it, Jason?
Meaning that process
of activates the switch by eating tons of fruit. Now, fruit is healthy, right? Mm-hmm. You and I know that if you eat 3 or 4 fruit a day, you're doing very well. But the bear doesn't eat 3 or 4 fruit.
Right.
It eats thousands of grapes at a time. I mean, and they eat berries, and I mean, they eat
whatever's there.
They
right.
eat kilograms of the stuff, and in one day, honestly, and so they get a lot of the sugar in fruit, and that sugar is called fructose. And remember, fruit has a ton of good things like vitamin C and all these things that are great for the brain. They're great for people. But when the fruit ripens, all the good things go down, and as the sweetness goes up, the sugar content goes up, and all the good stuff goes down, like vitamin C and all the flavonols. And so really ripe fruit, which is what animals like, we tend to like the tart fruit that has vitamin C and all the good stuff. But these animals will eat lots of ripe fruit and eat huge amounts of fructose. Now, for us, there is a way we can get a lot of fructose, but it's not from fruit, because there's only like 3 or 4 grams in a fruit. So if you eat 1 or 2 fruits a day, you're not going to get much fructose, and the intestine inactivates the first 5 grams or so of fructose. So you can eat a couple of fruit without a problem, but if you drink a soft drink, now what they've done is they've put high fructose corn syrup. Get the name, high fructose. So
it's pumping it right into your
fructose,
it's pumping it right into your system, right? Which is interesting, because I want to pause, because you're hitting something so important. And I think this is central to one of the many reasons why I started this podcast, right? And I want to not that I want to interrupt, but I want to pause so people can really digest digest what you're right, because we're digesting stuff we shouldn't be digesting, right? It's going back into just from your world as a medical doctor, my world as a therapist. I 100% agree with you that like a lot of the things that we're seeing, that I'm seeing, I just had a conversation with a potential new client that has a medical, psychological mood, a mood based disorder that they think might have been considered one of the diagnoses you mentioned. And I already started talking to them about their food and their other stuff. And we don't realize that even though we know this, and people say, yeah, I know this, but yet have this stuckness of not changing even the most simple of habits of, but it's okay if I have my soda when I'm out to dinner. It's okay if I but it's the once in a while, it's okay if I treat myself and I throw out my personal rules about eating healthy and clean or whatever it might be. Like that one time still can lead up to or reacclimate a new baseline for what your body is craving or functioning off. And I want to take a step back just to go, because you threw a word out that I really do believe, from as a mental health practitioner who does mind-body integrative work, and from your world, is the word inflammation. And you said something about inflammation being in the blood. And I'm sure a lot of people, if they caught that, they're like, most people probably didn't even catch that. But if they did hear that, like, what do you mean there's inflammation in my blood? Let's go back to just the biomarker for people to know what inflammation, right? What is inflammation? Oh, well, I have pain in my joints when I wake up in the morning, or, my shoulder hurts, or my cheeks are puffy from allergies and sinuses. Those are all inflammation. But when you said inflammation in the blood, I just want to go back there before we go too far down the rabbit hole. And can you just talk about that and the markers and what people should be going in and demanding that their doctors check? Because a lot of times oh, well, your insurance won't cover that, or I don't know why we need to test that. You're fine, right? What should they be looking at? What should they be going for, as far as the inflammation markers, and what does inflammation actually mean when you said there's inflammation in your blood?
Yes. So I'm going to get to that. And the very first thing I'm going to just say is in the survival switch, a low grade inflammation, very, very low grade, can kind of heighten your immune system to help fight infection. Mm-hmm. So it was meant to be a survival benefit. It's kind of like heightening your white cells so that if you get an infection, you can really be safe. It can help fight it. That was the idea. But what's happened is that people have recognized that inflammation, although it's there to help you fight infection, if it's staying chronically, it does bad things to us. And inflammation makes our blood vessels not work as well. They don't dilate as well as they should. They don't hum. They're kind of like they constrict a little bit, and it can drive blood pressure up, and it can drive the fat in the liver. Instead of just being fat, it can cause liver injury, and then you can get a disease called cirrhosis and liver failure. And in the kidney, it can cause kidney damage. And so inflammation is actually a way to damage tissues. Inflammation is a way to speed aging. And so when you get this metabolic syndrome and you have this low-grade inflammation, if it was just for a couple of weeks or a month, when you're sleeping without any food, if you're a big bear, a little bit of inflammation is pretty good, but not for us all the time. And there was this beautiful work by a guy named Paul Ritger, who's at Harvard. and he's a cardiologist, and he found that people with heart attacks often have this inflammation, and he measured a particular substance called C-reactive protein. It's also known as CRP.
Yep.
And some people call it the highly sensitive CRP. So there's a little HSCRP, but it's a very common blood test. You can go out and get it. You should get it. And it's the test that he used to look at people who were susceptible for heart attacks. And he found that if you have an elevated CRP, that it increases your risk for heart attacks. And it turns out that it's like a big cause of heart attacks. Maybe 15% or so of the heart attacks can be ascribed to this inflammation marker. The marker kind of associates with this inflammation. And if he blocks the inflammation, and they're now developing drugs to try to block inflammation, you can reduce the risk for heart attacks. So I asked him, do you know what's driving this inflammation? Because, he's now measuring it on many people, and it's not clear. But our work suggests that it's associated with a substance called uric acid. And uric acid is also in the blood. It's a simple blood test. And if the uric acid is high, it can cause frank inflammation in a disease called gout, where you develop these joint pains, typically like in the big toe. And I mean, you can barely walk. It's a red, hot, inflamed foot. And it's due to the uric acid, and the uric acid can form crystals in the joints. Well, now they're finding that if your uric acid is really high, you can get crystals of uric acid in your blood vessels. And even if there are no crystals, the uric acid is very, very strongly linked with inflammation. And it's also involved in, it looks like it's involved in behavioral disorders, including ADHD. People with ADHD seem to have higher uric acids, and people with bipolar disease seem to have higher uric acid, and people with obesity and metabolic syndrome have a higher uric acid. And it's actually part of this survival switch. Uric acid gets activated. So there are two blood tests I recommend, Jason. One is the HSCRP, or just CRP, you can tell your doctor, and uric acid. And you should get those measured. And if they're high, you should, really think about diet and health, and trying to exercise and eat better foods. And you can try that first, and that can work. Things like the DASH diet, the Mediterranean diet. I have a diet in my book that's pretty good. Trying to lose weight will help lower the inflammation.
Staying away from soda, doing and high fructose corn syrup.
Good therapy. All these kinds of things. So you want to. Inflammation is a secret weapon that's attacking us, and you don't have to have any symptoms. You don't have to have fever. You don't have to have. It can just be kind of invisible, and then, suddenly you get a heart attack. And what they've shown is, there's this cholesterol buildup that occurs in your blood vessels when you have coronary artery disease. Heart attacks are associated with thickening and irregularity of the arteries, and the uric acid is often present in these diseased arteries. And the diseased arteries often have inflammation as well. So even if it's not the uric acid, the inflammation in those arteries is reflected in elevations in CRP and uric acid.
I have this image of the one you were describing, the way things should be working is kind of the super trains in China or the in Europe that are going 100 miles an hour. The tracks are clean, everything is good. And then you have like, the blood here, which could be like, I think there would be a lot of traffic, right? There could be
Yeah.
the cholesterol, like now it's clogging up. And right now you have, 10 miles, 50 miles, and everything's moving slow. It's like, your Google Maps turning red while you're driving. And then you can have the vessels, like you were talking about. I see that as like the infrastructure, right? The
Yeah.
roads are crappy. There's construction. There's a
Exactly.
lot of potholes. There's a lot of, so I think like both are so important for us to look at. And one of the things when you're talking about crystals, and we don't have to get into this, but I just want people to, so when they're listening, they can look into this as well, connected to the uric acid and the crystals, is, oxalic acid, right? Is high oxalated food. And everybody's talking about like, kale and celery
Yeah.
and doing all those things. And there are certain people out there that like, are pushing having a celery juice every single day.
Yeah.
But I want people to know that there is high oxalates in those type of foods that
Yeah.
can also be causing thing that, even though there are certain people in a medical or, medical adjacent communities that are pushing those things, to also be mindful of the oxalic acid, the
Yes,
oxalate.
that's right. I published a paper on a patient of mine who presented with, I mean, she came to me with severe oxalate crystals in her skin and her eyes, and she had chronic kidney disease and
Mm-hmm.
was taking a lot of foods with high oxalate, and so it can be a real severe problem.
Yeah.
But
So
yeah, so anyway, good.
yeah, so let's talk more about this mind
The,
body, right? The stress. Let's talk about this, right? When you're talking about like sugar, we're talking about metabolic syndrome. Again, we're going to use these terms a little bit synonymously of like chicken or egg, right? I guess at this point, for all of us, it's the end of 2022, going into 2023. What are some things that people should be practicing? They should be avoiding, they should be understanding. So I know like over the last couple of years, let's just go down a little bit of the out of the box healing path, right? Everybody's trying to like go into like, a bunch of years ago it was, more of the stevia, more of the other more natural slash fake sugars and stuff like that. And I know some people say like it's fine, like if you're having, stevia, or if you, forget the sweet and lows and all the aspartame based foods. No one should be taking those. And if you're listening to this, please, I implore you, get rid of any of the fake sugars. But, when we're talking about this metabolic response, from your research, have you seen the body be discerning between any of the type of sugar intake, whether it's real, white sugar, brown sugar, versus a stevia, versus the agave, versus a sweet and low? Yep.
Yeah. So it's a very good question. So I mean, there's two aspects to sweets. One is how does it affect things like craving and behavior,
Mm-hmm.
and the other is does it affect metabolic syndrome and obesity? And so let's talk about both. So first off, there's pretty good data that we have these sweet receptors in our tongue, and when you eat sweets, you get a little bit of dopamine, which is kind of like a wanting response, and it's linked with pleasure as well. And so what's happened is that people who are, let's say you're addicted to sugar, and how do you block that craving? And you do all the things that you do, which is to try to help them cope with it and figure out ways to do it. But other things that people do, well, for example, some people will try switching to artificial sugars. But the problem is that the artificial sugars continue to reinforce the liking of sweets.
Yeah.
And so they don't actually help you get off the craving.
And aren't they actually produced to be more sweet exponentially than actual sugar itself?
Yeah, they can be sweeter for sure. On a gram per gram basis, they're much sweeter. But it is interesting. Like if I knock out the taste receptor,
Mm-hmm.
you'll still be addicted to sugar, but you will lose your craving for artificial sugars. So there is this difference. The sugar is working, real sugar has fructose in it. Fructose is the guy, high fructose corn syrup and fructose in real sugar. And it wires the brain to like it, for you to like it, even if you can't taste it. But artificial sugars will still keep you looking for sweets. So that's one problem. Now, when we give artificial sugars, and I do agree with you, things like stevia and monk fruit are preferable. But if you give artificial sugars to an animal, we cannot make them get obese by just giving it to them alone. And so if we give it with regular food, the animals don't gain weight, they don't develop diabetes. So from that standpoint, they're good in the sense that they don't, but they still make you addicted. And now, as I've been reading, there have been some studies that find that animals, that if you give sugar and an artificial sugar together, that may cause more desire for food than sugar alone, and can lead to more weight gain. So it may well be that artificial sugars mixed with sugar can do more things, but alone, if I just give normal chow to an animal and then put them on artificial sugar, I can't really get them to become overweight. So anyway, so it's a little complicated, but the bottom line is, it's
interesting because the organic foods, right? If you're going to, like, let's say like a natural food store or whatever, even your local grocery store, and you're getting like a non-dairy or more of a healthy version of an ice cream, right? A lot of them do have those mixed sugar. You'll have like, organic sugar, and you'll have monk fruit, or you'll have stevia, or you'll have some other. So that's interesting, right? And again, just
it's kind of scary,
right?
Exactly.
And a lot of people don't realize that even sugar is still sugar, and mixed sugars. So going back to what you just said as far as this data and the science, like, people should just be mindful of that. If
be mindful. I try not to view artificial sugars as a mixed bag that they probably are going to keep you craving. When mixed with sugar, they might actually increase your weight. But anyway, I agree. The best possibility is to try to avoid, or try to minimize artificial sugars. If you do use them, stevia is good, monk fruit's good. There's this new one called allulose that might be good. So that's kind of where I am now. There are some artificial sugars that do cause obesity, and one is agave is often used as a sweetener, but it's actually composed of fructose. So it's really the wrong one to pick.
Right. And even though it says low glycemic index response, I have a friend of mine who's a functional nutritionist, did blood labs on people. And
Another so that's one you got to watch out for. Another one is a lot of low sugar ice creams will add a compound called sorbitol to sweeten the ice cream or to sweeten the syrup. It's really common in syrups, like sugar-free syrup. It'll have sorbitol, but sorbitol gets converted to fructose in the body, so you don't want to eat that one.
And if you eat too much of it, you guys might want to be near a bathroom, because it might.
Yes, exactly.
Damage your.
So those are some of the problems with those guys.
So from the emotional side, right? When we're talking about ADHD, when we're talking about, mood disorders or stuff like that. I mean, obviously, like, there are people who may have, it could be potentially genetic. There could be other factors going on.
Right.
But mitigating stress, like, I know we could go. So I feel like there's two different ways of looking at it. One is like what we do to tamp down stress. And when I'm using like neuroemotional technique, for example, and I'm doing food cravings, right? A lot of times what people are going for, whether it's any one of the, the salty, spicy, whatever, sweet, any of the umami flavors, right? What that usually is that it's the neurology is kind of finding its own version of Tylenol to tamp down an unconscious trigger, right? And we can find that using neuroemotional technique. What's the original event, and why is your body, you're craving something. And whenever I hear that, I usually use this modality specifically for that. So we can find the original trauma that's triggering that you're going for some food or a drink or a drug or some type of shopping, whatever it might be, right? Some type of overwhelming behavior that isn't serving you. But that's part of it, right? That's the unconscious part of what is being triggered, that you're using this,
Yeah.
what I would call, right, to be the Tylenol to dull or numb whatever the
Yes.
trigger is unresolved. Then you have the reoccurring pattern. Then you have the, well, now
Right.
this is the new baseline. So even when you don't have
Right.
that, your body, right, your brain and your body, your
Right.
physiology is now going for that just because it's
Right.
conditioned to do that.
Yes. Conditioning and habits end up amplifying these pathways, and these biologic pathways that I'm talking about. They're biologic pathways, but we still have our core, there's a lot of our brain that can be used to help counter that. I mean, just because if you see something you really want, but it's not there for you to take, we have our ability to say, hey, okay, I may really want that, but I'm
That's the
strong
impulse
enough
control,
to
right? That's the ADHD or the ADD, that impulse, or even when you're talking about certain mood disorder,
impulsivity, right?
impulsivity, whether it's in bipolar or whether it's in ADHD. I think right, that's the similarity of that impulse control, the delayed gratification. And I mean, obviously, we're
Right.
living in instant gratification society, but when you're talking about like food and what modulates that or what moderates that, maybe would be a better way to do that, right? The sugar, would you say, I mean, I know you kind of hinted at this before, but would you say like there would be, if someone goes and have a sugar-based or a high fructose-based food, would you see, whether it's in the blood or whether it's in brain scans, those areas in the brain that are lighting up for more impulsive or
Yes.
more distracted
Yes.
or more compulsive type thought
Yes.
processes?
Right. So it turns out, I'm going to need to bring this up because our work shows that it's fructose that drives this. But interestingly, the fructose that it goes to the brain is often made in the brain. And the way we make fructose is you can make it from fructose we eat. So like if we're eating a lot of sugar or high fructose corn syrup, especially liquid sugars, like soft drinks and power drinks, that gives us this flood of fructose, and fructose production goes up in the brain in response. But interestingly, fructose production goes up in the brain as well from two other things. Okay. And they're both, one is when you eat starchy foods, like, and your glucose goes up in the blood, high glycemic carbs like bread, rice, potatoes, chips, that actually, when the blood glucose goes up, some of that glucose gets converted to fructose, including in the brain. And so, if you're eating a lot of carbs, that can increase fructose in the brain. The other one that tends to accelerate it is if it's salty. So if the carbs are salty, like fries or French fries or chips, the salt drives that conversion from glucose to fructose faster. So salty foods and high glycemic carbs are these carbs that, like potatoes, rice,
tubers,
and then sugar. These
are
are the main ones. Now, when the fructose goes up in the brain, it turns out that there's certain regions of the brain that are involved in self-control and in deliberation and in memory, and those get inhibited. So you can actually show a reduction in activity of those areas, whereas the areas stimulating foraging tend to go up. They tend to be activated. So fructose activates like the anterior cingulate gyrus, a part of the brain that drives foraging, and it inhibits other areas of the brain involved in self-control. So that makes it harder to for behavioral therapy to work if you're constantly eating sugar and stuff. So the best way to do that is, not only do you want to have the training that you're providing, but you want to eat healthy to try to do your best to keep the brain wiring as good as possible. And so the foods that you should try to reduce include sugary foods. Read the wrappers. If you see a lot of high fructose corn syrup, try to avoid it. Don't eat a lot of salted French fries and potato chips and Doritos and
Definitely
all
not.
those
Well,
kinds of
well,
things.
anything with the MSG
They're
stuff.
not
Yeah.
good for you.
Yeah.
And then
anybody who doesn't know this, the autolyzed yeast extract that you see as an ingredient, or Tarula yeast, is just another version of monosodium glutamate. So if
yes,
you did
and
not know that,
glutamate's
y'all.
not good.
Yeah. So anything with
Glutamate's not good. And then,
yeah.
Another thing is, drink lots of water. Water is a wonderful treatment. Try not to eat too much salt, and drink a lot of water. Foods that have omega-3 are really good for behavior and brain, and they kind of counter the effects of fructose. So like walnuts and things that are like salmon and omega-3 supplements. Actually, I recommend them. They can counter some of the fructose effects. And things like dark chocolate, believe it or not, 70% dark chocolate contains green tea, contains substances that kind of block
That's
fructose.
the polyphenols. Is that would that be the
what one?
Is that the polyphenols in there?
Yeah, the polyphenols, those in
Yeah.
particular. There's one called epicatechin. It's just a wonderful one that helps counter. It's in chocolate, dark chocolate. And I've done clinical studies with epicatechin. It's really something that dark chocolate's good. Vitamin C, like at low dose. At high dose, you get that oxalic acid, but like at 500 milligrams a day, it's like it actually helps. So all these things, so I recommend not only do you do strong, follow all the recommendations Jason is making about, how to deal with these, psychological problems, but you also try to eat healthy, because that's going to help make a big difference. And there's good foods and bad foods. I do talk about this a lot in my book. And I try to explain how it works and why this is such a good thing to do.
Yeah. So when we're going through, right, we're in a very high stress world.
Yes.
For the last couple of years, and right, there's unfortunately still not a day where we don't, obviously, if anybody's watching and leaves their news channel on, on the TV all day, you're already doing something that I would say get rid of, and I don't know. I don't get this. Like, I meet people all the time, like, oh no, I just I have the news on in the background. I'm like, why? Like, well, I need to be informed.
Yeah, it's
about negative, about bad things.
Yeah, because so much of it's negative. It's just terrible.
Right. Or if you have the apps on your phone that the news things pop up, like, please. Like I did that years ago, even before the pandemic. I got rid of all the news apps on my phone, so I didn't get it popping up during the day with any updates. So sometimes I'm a little bit oblivious to what's going on, but like, I feel like we don't need to have it like racking ourselves, because we don't even realize, even if we like see it for like a half a second, our nervous system is going to respond to that. Just because our neocortex, our rational intellectual brain, doesn't process it, doesn't mean our survival instinct brain isn't. Right. And a lot of what you're talking about is what's triggering all of this, right?
Yeah,
and
when I get stressed, I often will suddenly look to eat something. It's a terrible stress response, but it's like, I get nervous and fidget and want to like eat. And some people do the opposite, but for me, that as the world gets more stressful, this is a behavior pattern that is really important to try to get to block.
Right.
There's another thing, you don't have to activate the biologic switch. If you get in a confined room where and if you just stay in your house and you have food there, people don't have anything to do. People eat out of boredom. And it's not because there's a biologic drive. It's because, you're bored. And animals in cages, it's a very common way in the zoo. These animals get fat. It's not that they necessarily are hungry, but they just don't really, if the food's there, they'll eat it. So there's a lot of psychology to weight gain. It isn't just a biologic drive, but there is a biologic drive. We for sure have identified it, and it's driven by specific foods. So
It's interesting because right now I
healthy
think
healthy diet helps.
a healthy diet. Well, I think it's primary, and it's interesting. Like when people call me or when I'm working with them and they're not like, I'll tell them up front, like, here's what I hear is going on. Here's my speculation. Tell me about this. Like, I'll even ask like about their bowel movements and like stuff like that and menstrual cycles and right. All that. And they're like, no other, Jason. No, because I don't want to be stuck in a, right. It's fine. Right. Cause you're doing a lot of stuff that pushes back against the fundamental, medical world and you're doing it with clinical research and all that. And right. And you have expertise in your area, but like, and I mean, this is a very important segment of the conversation where there are people everywhere that are going to their doctor and they're presenting this stuff and their doctors will roll their eyes or they'll say, especially with thyroid stuff, which we haven't even got into. We're not even going to get into that, especially with like adrenals and I'm like, oh, I'm actually at a loss for words because with how frustrated I am by seeing people that I know or me or other people I hear about going to doctors and say, hey, can you run this? And they're being told no. Can you that's why I say the C-reactive protein or even vitamin D, right? And they're like, oh no, well you live in South Florida, your vitamin D should be fine. Well, no, it's probably not.
It is a shame that as physicians, we want to try to serve our patients and, and they come first, and so, if a patient is concerned about inflammation is often not visible to anybody. So I do think it's wise to measure inflammation markers, right. And it is wise to look for things like insulin resistance. It's so common. 25% of the population have it. There's things that can be done for it. And uric acid turns out to be a big predictor of all kinds of things. So it makes sense to measure it. So, some of it is just the need to educate the physician community better. Right. But I do think that we have an obligation to listen to our patients. And, there may be times people ask for tests that are, the tests are just really not indicated or they're very expensive and you really need to discuss with the patient why they really want that test, but I do think that we're here to try to help people. And
sure. And maybe one of the takeaways from this is like the beautiful thing about what you're doing is that if there's anybody listening to this and they're hitting walls, is to buy your book, to buy your books, to read it, to bullet point it, to take some notes.
Yep.
And then, tell your doctor to read it.
Yes.
Buy it, right. I mean, I know one of your World of Nephrology, Dr. Fung, Dr. Jason Fung, who's written, and beautiful things about the work you're doing. Right. I hear it all the time because I'm in one of the Facebook groups from people who are in that community, and I just see how many people are hitting walls, right? And like, right, the World of Nephrology and published, right. So and how the patients, how us are just hitting walls when we know that what hasn't been working isn't working.
Yeah. Well, the science is strong. My book it could be given to any physician. I've written hundreds of research papers. Right. I'm a highly cited scientist. And so, it's true. We're doing a lot of state of the art. So that, if you trained 10 years ago, you may not be aware of all the stuff. So you could bring my book in. You could email me if there are real issues. I'd be happy to help. But I think we can, these are doable things. These getting blood tests and so forth, that's a pretty easy kind of thing to do.
Yeah. And I think it's so important. That's why I'm so appreciative and I was so excited to have you on today because you and I, like we talked about before, right? The integrative, the mind body, the functional medicine, right? Just looking at food as medicine, right? From that paradigm. And yes, even if there is supplementation to enhance it, because your body, you might have leaky gut, you might have other things where your body can't break down all the food that it's naturally eating and it needs some help to get there and eventually be there. like, I'm so thankful that this is showing up, right? I know you're doing a lot of it. I know Jefferson University, where my mentors are Dr. Dan Monti and Dr. Andrew Newberg, are leading the Marcus Institute of Integrative Medicine over there, right? And they're doing all the research for neuroemotional technique there as well. So like, it's finally happening, right? Stuff that people were afraid to either like do research on as medical doctors and say, hey, like, we know this to be true. We're hearing enough anecdotal. We're trying this. And we're afraid to be smeared by the rest of our colleagues or patients.
Functional medicine's real medicine. Integrative physiology is another area. I mean, people are, looking at genes, but we realize that it's the whole body, and it's the mind, body, diet, environment, interactions. And so, even climate change and heat stress and all these things can affect us too. Behavior, health. I write a lot about that. So anyway, very good.
Yeah. So good. As we wrap up, I want people to be able to find you. Obviously your books are available, right. All major book sales, and we'll put all links in the bio, but right now you have the most recent is Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, the surprising science behind why we gain weight and how we can prevent it and reverse it. We have the Sugar Fix, the Fat Switch, and right, for anybody's listening and they go to their doctor and they're like, well, who is this guy that you're quoting in this book, right? All you do I love this, right? Just refer to, hey, look up the comprehensive clinical nephrology, right? Right. Yeah. If you want to, this guy knows what he's talking about. Like that's,
I'm the founding editor. That's the top textbook in our specialty.
Exactly. So, right. I want people to realize that you can be empowered. There are medical doctors like you that are wanting us to be more empowered and to become more informed consumers. Right. And I really, really, really do appreciate it. And rather that you guys, if you want more, you can go to his website, drrichardjohnson.com. Right. And all the good stuff is there. You can follow him on Instagram. And again, I really do want to thank you. And hopefully in the future, we'll have a follow up and go deeper into some other things and maybe more tactical, practical. And
well, thank you too, Jason.
Awesome. Thank you.
Totally great pleasure to be on your show.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for listening to the You Winning Life podcast. If you are ready to minimize your personal and professional struggles and maximize your potential, we would love it if you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook at You Winning Life.